All right, today in the Ubuntu Server series, we're going to talk about virtualization. Now, I've actually split the virtualization concept up into two different nuggets. On the next nugget, we're going to talk about cloud infrastructure and Ubuntu Cloud. In this nugget, we're specifically going to talk about the traditional types of virtualization, where you have, like for example, a commercial ESX VM host. You can do the same sort of thing with Ubuntu Server, and we're going to do that fairly quickly, but we're going to set up an actual guest and host and remote management environment here on our test systems. We're going to use KVM for our virtualization platform, and we're going to use libvirt to manage that. I also want to mention Juice in VM Builder, although we're not going to actually go through an entire install of Juice. I'm just going to talk about it so you know what it is and when you would want to install that. Let's get down to business. We're going to start with KVM. Now, there are a bunch of different virtualization platforms or virtualization environments that a person can choose from. There's ESX from VMware, there's Xen. For our purposes today, in the default in Ubuntu, we're going to focus on KVM, which stands for Kernel Virtual Machine. This is a very efficient and very powerful virtualization platform that will work right in your running server. Now, KVM does require specific CPU support for virtualization. That's pretty much the case with most virtualization platforms, is that they're going to require that you have the CPU virtualization support. Now, this is something that's often turned off in BIOS. So even if your CPU does support it, and most modern CPUs will support virtualization, you probably have to go into BIOS and turn that on, and then it should be detected. Now, we're going to go on the command line and see how we can tell if your CPU currently supports it or not. Now, again, KVM is not the only technology, but it's Ubuntu's default and it's very efficient. So it's what we're going to set up today as our virtualization platform to show the power of running as a virtual host in Ubuntu Server. The way you can check to see if your computer supports using KVM virtualization, or actually most virtualization platforms, is to open up a terminal window. Now, this terminal again is on our workstation. This is not on the remote server that we normally work on. And you need to install a tool called CPU Checker. So once you're there, simply type kvm-ok and it'll let you know if you can run KVM. In our case, this CPU does not support KVM extension, so we cannot run the KVM virtualization platform on our workstation here. However, over here on our server, I've actually already installed the CPU Checker program, and as you can see, KVM acceleration can be used. So on our server, we are going to be able to use the KVM virtualization environment on our server, not on our workstation. And that I did that on purpose. I actually set up in my environment here that this server would be able to run as a virtual host. This machine, our workstation, would not. On the workstation, we're actually going to use management tools, but this virtualization has to happen on our remote server here. So that's what we're going to do to install the actual virtual host tools in order to be able to host guest operating systems. However, in order to interface with that, we actually have to use another tool, and that tool is libvirt. So if you're familiar with VMware, basically you install ESX or ESXi on your bare metal system. However, that computer, you can't really do much on that physical computer. When you plug in a keyboard, you can't do much apart from, see what the IP address is. You actually have to use a remote tool, vSphere or some other such thing, or some command line tools to manage the virtual hosts that are hosted on your machine. Well, that's what libvirt does. Now, libvirt is a neat project. It's actually trying to be the end-all solution for managing all virtualization platforms. Right, lofty goals, but hey, that's how Linux people roll. Basically, it will connect to a multitude of different virtualization environments. In our case, it is going to be KVM that we connect to because that's the system that we're installing, but it does support others. It will connect to Xen, it will connect to VMware, I believe. You need some other plugins, but it will connect to different virtualization platforms using the same tools, libvirt. Now, it will also manage local VMs or remote VMs on remote VM hosts, which is what we're going to set up. It includes a whole suite of command line interface tools, but it also has a very awesome GUI And all that GUI does is it gives you a nice click point visual way to utilize those underlying command line interface tools. We're going to use the GUI because it's really cool, but I'm going to point out the different CLI tools that it's actually using in the background. Now, something that's really, I'm glad that we did SSH earlier in this series, because in order to connect to our KVM host, we're going to have SSH keys already installed on our server so that we can log in via SSH without any password authentication. Because the way that VMware the way that libvirt works, it can't prompt us for that login and password, so we have to have that already set up, which, hey, we already do, right? That's cool. So the first thing we're going to do is install KVM on our server, and then we're going to get libvirt set up so that we can manage it, and then we will actually do some work in our virtual environment. So first things first, let's install KVM on the server. So back here on our server, we can see that KVM is able to be installed. So we're going to do that. We're going to say sudo apt-get install KVM for the kernel virtual machine subsystem. Then we're also going to install libvirt bin virtinst for installation tools. There's also some other things that we can install, but for right now, this is all we're going to install. It's going to have a whole bunch of dependencies. We'll let those download and install. So our KVM system is completely up and running and set to go. Now there is one thing we have to do. Now we have those SSH keys installed. However, we do have to make sure that the user that is going to be administering the virtual machines is in the proper group. And so to do that, we have to type sudo add user. For me, well, we're going to use spowers because that's our current user. And what this does is it adds the user spowers to the libvirtd group. And you see that group was just created right here. So this is a group that was just freshly created, and now whoever needs to be able to manage the virtual machines has to be in that group. So we're going to type enter, and it actually says that my user is already a member of libvirtd. Well, that's fine. It's not a problem. You know, it didn't change anything. However, it's important that you know whatever user is going to manage the virtual machines has to be in that group. All right, so in my case it was already there, but I wanted to mention it because it's something that is important and may not be obvious if you're trying to connect in a few minutes. So that's all there is to install on the server. Our server is now ready to host virtual machines. The next step is going to be done on our workstation, because the workstation is not actually hosting virtual machines, but it has the GUI interface that we're going to use to install stuff. Now, on our command line only system, if you're really a hardcore nerd and you want to do things like use a command line tool like virt install, this will actually install a virtual machine based on all sorts of command line flags. Some of these, it just mentions a few that are absolutely required. You have to name it, you have to tell how much RAM, what sort of disk it's going to be using, what type of CD-ROM, is it going to boot over PXE? There's all sorts of things you specify on the command line to create a virtual machine right here on the command line. Those tools are there, they're awesome, and it's neat that you can do that on the command line, but I want to show you the GUI tool because this can be run from a remote computer like we have here, and it'll be more familiar to most people. And to be honest, as much of a green text on black screen guy as I am, I really like a GUI when I'm managing virtual machines, especially if I'm trying to set up something or make some changes. I like to visualize what's going on. So on this computer, we're going to install some different tools. Here, the tool we need to install is Virt Manager. Now this does not require that we have those CPU extensions enabled. This is just the remote management tool. So this doesn't require that special CPU flag that would be enabled in BIOS. This is just so that we can run the remote tools. So it's all set up, and now if we go into our clicky GUI system here we have the Virtual Machine Manager. And now it's going to give us this error when we start up, and this is to be expected. It says, hey, there aren't any local guests for me to manage, because it will manage, remember, it'll manage local and remote systems. Would you like to install KVM? No, we don't want to have anything hosted locally. So we need to add a connection. And that's where we have the choices here. Now by default, these are the only 3 that are installed. That's okay, we actually want this KVM one. Okay, we want KVM, we want to connect to a remote host. We're going to use SSH because SSH is already set up. Username, spowers, hostname, CBT server. and we'll have it auto connect. So we connect, and that's it. We're completely connected. Now by default, this is just a KVM host with no machines on it. But if we right click, we can go into the details and look at just a little bit of information about CBT server. So it shows how we're connected. It shows the amount of RAM. It's a 2 GB system, 1 CPU, the architecture. It's actually using its own virtual network, which is kind of cool. It sets up a virtual network that it forwards via NAT to the rest of the environment. Now, if you want to get a more complex setup, we actually could set up a bridged interface here. We're just going to use the default NAT interface. And then storage. By default, it uses a folder on the server over here. This is our server. And it uses the file system directory of varlib libvirt images for where it stores the VM images. Now we can add another, let's say we had, another pool of files stored in iSCSI or some other, area that, like another folder on a file, another hard drive or another physical drive to use as raw storage. So we can add a storage pool, but by default it uses this folder varlib libvirt images on this server back here, right, on our server. And what I did when the video was paused here is I uploaded an Ubuntu server ISO into this folder. So that's why it shows right here that there's an ISO file over here. I can show you. If we look inside that folder, I downloaded that server image, that ISO image, into that folder so that we could see it, and we're going to use it in a second as well. So there it is. It shows the storage on there. We actually can't configure the network interfaces on the server. We haven't installed all the tools to do that. But libvirt, again, it tries to be everything. So it's very powerful, and we can see all of the information. So that's about the server itself. This is about the CBT server host that we just looked at. Now, in order to create a virtual machine, we click on the fancy button here, or we could go to File, Create New VM. Let's call it Test Server. Let's see, how would we like to install the operating system? We're going to use local install media. We're going to use that ISO image that I uploaded. Okay, so we'll check that. And what ISO image are we going to use? Well, let's use that one I uploaded. How convenient. So it's right there. The OS type, it's going to be a Linux operating system. Version, it's actually 1204. Click forward. How much memory do we want it to have? Now remember, it says right here we only have just under 2 gigs available on the host. So we'll say that this server is going to use 512 megabytes. We can only use one CPU. We only have one CPU on our server. So we'll click next. And then, do we want to enable storage? Right? Is this going to have its own little hard drive? Well, we'll say yes. And I like 8 gigs. It's pretty small, but if you remember, our server here doesn't have too much space either. So let's actually make this even smaller. Let's say 4 gigabytes. Allocate entire disk now. Now this means that, is it going to use like thin provisioning, or is it going to allocate the entire disk image right away? So if it does the whole disk image, like it says here in this little tooltip, it's going to take longer now because it basically writes out all the zeros, the empty file. We can skip the allocation, but it might cause space issues later because this is such a small hard drive. If there's not enough room for it, it might freak out. We're not going to allocate the entire disk now, only because I know that this disk drive over here is very small. Okay, there's no other storage that we're going to manage on this. We're going to create it in that local computer. So we'll click next. And then we get to decide, do we want to customize the configuration? Nah, we'll just look at it. And we'll just leave it like it is now, just like we set up here. Advanced options, the virtual network. Now see, we only have this one default network installed. Although we can give it a fixed MAC address. So it's going to assign its own MAC address to that. Virtualization type is KVM. That's the type of system that we have. Architecture, actually let's make this a 32-bit system instead of 64. That's the ISO image that I downloaded. And then what type of firmware? We're going to say default. We don't need it to be UEFI. So we'll click finish. And now it's going to create that machine and pop up this awesome little viewing window as well, which is just really slick. So now this should look familiar, right? We've installed Ubuntu server before. So I'm going to click English, and while we're here, I want to show you, if I press F4, we get to see modes here. Okay, so install a minimal virtual machine. Now what this means is install Juice. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but remember I mentioned that JEOS, install a minimal virtual machine. That will create this server to specifically be a virtual host device with no other abilities installed. It's like a very stripped down operating system just to be a virtual machine. Okay, so that's what we would do. Go through the installation process just like we would on a computer. I mean, this is a virtualized system, and it'll go through the install. We're not actually going to go through that entire install. We don't need to do that. We've installed systems quite a few times on here, right? So let's just force this computer off. Yes, I want to force it off. And the guest is not running, so we can close this window. And now you'll see when we connect, we have a list of all the VMs installed on the computer, like our test server, which right now is shut off. Now we can clone this, which is kind of a cool thing. If you have a base system and you want to create a clone, you can do that. If we want to open it up, here is the machine. We can go to view details about this particular machine, and then we can make some changes there as well. So let's say that we want it to boot, to CD every time, or we want it to auto start when our server boots up, which is something that is very important. If your server reboots, you want to make sure all your VMs restart. Well, this is where you go in and set that. So this is just a wonderful tool, this GUI tool, Virt Manager, that will allow us to manage all the virtual machines on our host. So if you ever wondered about setting up your own virtual environment, you don't necessarily have to get something like VMware ESXi. You can actually do it all with Ubuntu. All right, so that's pretty slick. That's how it works, and that's just the tip of the iceberg with libvirt. You can do a lot of command line stuff, but this is the gist of how to install it. I want to look at one more tool that I briefly mentioned, and then we'll be finished with this nugget. And I hope that you go and play using KVM virtualization because it's really slick. Really quick before we move on, I just want to reiterate, it's important to know that the only reason that Virt Manager worked is because we had SSH keys already installed. So that's really important to note, that SSH keys have to be installed so you can log in without any entering of passwords. All right. So I want to talk briefly about Jeus. Now, JEOS is pronounced juice, just like orange juice, and it stands for Just Enough Operating System. So when we were just seeing that server install, and I pressed F4 to give us the installation modes, that minimal virtualization system will install Jeus. And basically, it's just a stripped-down system that only has KVM installed. It's neat because it's a specialized version of Ubuntu Server that has, it's a stripped-down OS. It has a specific kernel designed for virtualization. And to choose it, you use the regular Ubuntu Server CD. And do you remember when we installed LTSP, we hit F4 and chose LTSP server? Well, it's the same process. During that boot up, like we just saw, you press F4 and you tell it that you want the minimal virtualization environment install option, and that's how it will install when we go through it. And then one last tool that I want to mention, and we're not actually going to demonstrate it, but VM Builder will automatically create, kind of like Kickstart does. Do you remember Kickstart we talked about when we did the installation at the beginning of this series? VM Builder will automatically build an entire system, including the installation steps, so we don't have to go through, next. VM Builder will create VMs automatically on the command line. It's like Kickstart, but for VMs. So if you have to create a lot of things, VM Builder is a powerful tool that you want to look at that just works from the command line. You specify, what OS, how big you want the hard drive, what size RAM, and it will not only create the virtual image or the virtual machine container, it will also install the operating system completely. It's awesome one-step magic that just does everything for you on the command line. All right, so that is virtualization in Ubuntu Server. We talked about KVM, we talked about libvirt, and I explained what Jeus is and how to install it, and I recommend that if you are building lots of different servers that you look at VM Builder to save yourself some time. But that's all it is a time saver. You can still go through and install from CD like we started to do with libvirt Manager. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.